Welcome back to the deep dive. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by complex philosophy, but secretly wanted to be the person who could explain the core ideas of the Enlightenment to a group of friends, you are in the right place. We take the source material, the foundational texts, the secondary analysis, the modern applications, and we really just try to extract the insights you need.
And today, we are strapping in for Immanuel Kant. This is not just a philosopher. This is arguably the central thinker of the Enlightenment, a figure whose rigorous, systematic works across epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, and aesthetics fundamentally restructured, well, the entire architecture of modern Western thought.
Okay, so let's try to unpack this monumental legacy. Kant's life, it spanned the 18th century-born Immanuel Kant in Königsberg in 1724, living all the way until 1804. And the sheer scope of his work is it's staggering.
Oh, it is?
It's no exaggeration to say that if you're studying philosophy after 1781, you are in some way responding to Kant. His project really did set the definitive structure for everything that came after.
Precisely. And our mission in this deep dive is to understand why Kant's approach is called the critical philosophy. His entire intellectual endeavor was monumental because he aimed to achieve two seemingly contradictory goals. First, to establish the ultimate immutable limits of human knowledge, what we can know.
Right.
And second, at the same time, to define the absolute universal foundations of moral action, what we must do.
That sounds like a heavy lift.
It is. We're going to traverse his famous trilogy, the three critiques of pure reason, practical reason, and judgment. And then we're going to take a massive leap into the 21st century to see how this 18th century system is proving profoundly relevant to some really urgent contemporary challenges. I'm talking specifically about the strange realities of quantum mechanics and the fundamental problem of hallucination in artificial intelligence.
Wow. Okay, but before we get to the critiques, I find it fascinating that the man who would become the epitome of, systematic philosophical rigor, he started his life deeply rooted in science. He showed great aptitude early on, enrolling at the University of Königsberg at just age 16. And notably, he spent his entire professional life within the orbit of that city and institution. He was a creature of habit, but intellectually, he covered the entire cosmos.
That scientific foundation is absolutely key to understanding his later work. His early studies were steeped in the dominant rationalist philosophy of the time, championed by figures like Leibniz and Wolff. And this school of thought, it believed that truth could be accessed primarily through reason alone, often independently of messy empirical observation.
But the sources highlight a critical influence, his mentor, Martin Nitzan. Nitzan seems to be the bridge that kept Kant from becoming purely dogmatic.
Absolutely. Nitzan exposed Kant to the burgeoning British empirical philosophy and, most importantly, to Isaac Newton's mathematical physics. This forced Kant to confront the necessity of empirical observation right alongside pure reason. It sort of inoculated him against the excesses of just abstract speculation.
I loved the anecdote about Nitzan actively dissuading Kant from what he considered the comfortable but lazy philosophical answers of the day. Nitzan was especially wary of idealism, the notion that reality is purely mental, and the theory of pre-established harmony, which posits that mind and body operate separately but are synchronized by God.
Yes, and Nitzan famously called pre-established harmony the pillow for the lazy mind.
I love that phrase.
It's fantastic, isn't it? It's a perfect summation of the spirit of Kant's entire critical project. He was determined to find the real systematic foundations for knowledge and morality, and he refused to accept dogmatic or easy answers that shut down inquiry.
And his pre-critical years were genuinely impressive scientifically. He wasn't just musing about planets, he was calculating them. In 1754, he argued that the moon's gravitational pull would slow Earth's rotation, which is a correct insight.
He expanded on that the very next year in his Universal Natural History and Theory of the Heavens. This work is significant because it laid out an early, detailed theory for the formation and evolution of the solar system, predicting the existence of galaxies beyond our own, which he called island universes. This is essentially a proto-version of the nebular hypothesis.
That's remarkable for a budding philosopher, and the sources point out another surprising insight. In 1756, he laid out some foundational thinking on the Coriolis force, that deflective force caused by the Earth's rotation, which is fundamental to meteorology and fluid dynamics.
And this tells us Kant wasn't satisfied until he understood not just what the universe was, but how it operated according to necessary universal laws. This scientific drive for necessary truth is the intellectual fuel that leads directly into his critical period, sparked by a challenge from halfway across Europe.
Right. And that's the moment that jolted Kant, the intellectual earthquake that ended his dogmatic slumber, came from the Scottish empiricist David Hume. Kant was 46 when he encountered Hume's skepticism, and it forced him to reassess everything he had inherited from rationalism. What was the central problem Hume presented that was so devastating?
Hume essentially pulled the rug out from under Western metaphysics and, you could argue, modern science itself. He argued that our most fundamental concepts like causality, substance, and objective morality are not actually derived from experience. If you watch two billiard balls collide, you never see the necessary connection, the force that makes the second ball have to move. You only observe constant conjunction, A follows B again and again.
So we develop a habit of expecting B after A, but we have no rational guarantee. We can't prove that the laws of nature or even logical certainty must hold true tomorrow. This just destroys the certainty that rationalists assumed.
Exactly. If Hume was right, then not only was metaphysics reduced to psychological habit, but even the certainty of Newtonian physics, which relied on universal, necessary causal laws, was undermined. Kant recognized that if reason couldn't overcome this radical skepticism, then the entire Enlightenment project was built on sand.
So Kant's massive response, the Critique of Pure Reason, or CPR, was published in 1781. And we know from the sources that it was over 800 pages, dense, convoluted, and initially disappointed its readers because it was so hard to follow.
Oh, the style was famously opaque. He used terms in new and hyper-specific ways, which forced him to publish the Prolegomena to any future metaphysics just 2 years later to clarify his aims. But the goal of the CPR was singular. It was not to expand knowledge infinitely, but to establish the precise, necessary limits of how far reason may legitimately proceed. This is what we call the self-limitation of reason applying critical judgment to itself.
The self-limitation is what enables his famous philosophical maneuver, often called the Copernican revolution in metaphysics.
Exactly. In astronomy, Copernicus shifted the perspective. Instead of assuming the celestial bodies revolve around the observer Earth, he proposed the observer. Earth revolves around the center, the sun. Kant executed an analogous shift in philosophy. Traditional philosophy assumed that our knowledge must passively conform to objects out there in the world. Kant flipped this. He proposed that worldly objects must conform, at least in part, to the structure of our minds.
So instead of the mind merely recording reality, the mind actively shapes reality as we perceive it.
Precisely. The structure of reality as we know it is partially contributed by us, and this is the crucial counter to Hume. Kant argued that certain fundamental structures like space, time, and causality are not learned from experience. They are the innate, a priori conditions that make experience possible in the first place. We don't experience the cause and then invent the concept. We apply the concept of cause to the manifold of sensory input in order to have a coherent experience.
That distinction, the act of shaping by the mind, leads directly to his explanation of how we cognize the world, which requires two fundamental pillars.
Yes, objective human experience relies on the necessary interaction between intuition and concepts. Neither can function without the other.
Okay, let's dedicate some time to clarifying this distinction because it's the engine of the whole system. What exactly is intuition in the Kantian sense?
Intuition is raw, sensory input. It's the object of sensibility, a non-discursive, meaning non-linguistic or non-judgmental representation of a particular object. Think of the specific redness of an apple, the coldness of the glass, the specific shape right in front of you. This is the that of experience. Our faculty of sensibility is purely receptive. It is passively affected by objects external to us.
Okay, so intuition is pure receptive data, the raw manifold hitting the senses, and concepts.
Concepts belong to the understanding, which is the active part of the mind. A concept is a discursive or mediate representation of a general type of object. It involves the mind actively synthesizing, combining, and organizing the chaos of the sensory manifold. For example, when you look at that red shape, your mind applies the concept apple, which is a general rule for associating redness, roundness, texture, and maybe a memory of taste into one coherent, recognizable object.
Without the concepts, the intuition is just a chaos of meaningless colors and shapes. The mind is actively making sense of the chaos using its inherent rules.
That's the discursivity thesis. This is the underlying ontological assertion. Human knowledge is only possible because it requires both sensible affection, which is receiving the intuition, and active conceptual psychosis, which is applying the concept through understanding. Kant's famous summary of this relationship is just so powerful. Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind. You need both the structure, the concept, and the material, the intuition, to produce knowledge.
This leads us to the heart of his epistemology, transcendental idealism. And we have to clarify what transcendental means here because it's definitely not the New Age meaning.
Right. Something is transcendental If it is a necessary condition, a priori so, prior to experience, for the possibility of that experience.
Yeah.
And idealism implies mind dependence. So Kant's transcendental idealism asserts that the fundamental structures of our experience are contributed by our minds.
And the primary contributions are space and time.
Exactly. Kant argues that space and time are the transcendently ideal, pure forms of human sensibility. We don't discover space and time in nature. Rather, they are the innate subjective framework, or the universal cognitive goggles, through which all human beings must process external reality. They are literally the precondition for us to receive anything external.
Wait, so if there's subjective conditions, doesn't that mean the whole world is just subjective? How did Kant avoid the accusation that he was just a simple subjective idealist like George Berkeley?
That's the critical difference. Kant insists that while space and time are transcendentally ideal, so mind-dependent in their origin, they are also empirically real. This means that they apply universally to every possible object that can appear to us externally. Berkeley claimed that reality is purely mental, that objects cease to exist when not perceived. Kant rejected this. He insisted that there is a reality independent of our minds, but our minds impose a necessary structure on the way that reality appears to us.
And this differentiation introduces the famous and often confusing split between phenomena and noumena.
This is the ultimate limit-setting move. We only ever experience and know phenomenal appearances. These are objects as they are conditioned and structured by our subjective cognitive machinery, our forms of intuition, so space and time, and our understanding concepts. Phenomenal objects are knowable and subject to necessary laws like causality.
And the noumena.
The noumena are objects of pure thought, or things in themselves. This is the world as it exists independently of our minds, without being structured by our categories of understanding or filtered by space and time. And Kant says we cannot know the noumenal world. We can only refer to it in a negative sense, recognizing its existence as the cause of our sensations, but incapable of accessing it directly. The noumenal world is forever the border we cannot cross.
It's the ultimate statement of rational humility, reason admitting its own borders. But reason doesn't just stop there. It needs rules to structure the phenomena it can know. And that's where the categories come in.
The categories are the core of the CPR's analytic of concepts. There are the 12 pure concepts of the understanding. Think of them as the universal software, the fundamental concepts that articulate the necessary conditions for anything to count as a possible object of experience for a human. They are a priori meta-concepts.
The sources mention that Kant derived these 12 categories in a systematic, almost architectural way, which is key to his rigor. It wasn't just some random list he came up with.
That's right. This derivation is one of the most intellectually ambitious moves in philosophy. He didn't just pull them out of thin air. He derived them systematically from the 4 basic forms of logical judgment that human beings use when thinking: quantity, quality, relation, and modality.
Can you walk us through those 4 heads and maybe give us a couple of examples for each to show how they structure reality?
Certainly. The 4 heads of logical judgment represent how we combine concepts into judgments. So first, quantity. When we judge about a universal, all humans are mortal, a particular, some humans are philosophers, or a singular, Socrates is a man. Kant says the corresponding categories of quantity that structure our intuitions are unity, plurality, and totality. If you see a pile of apples, you perceive it as a totality composed of a plurality, which are all individual unities. These concepts are necessary for counting and mathematical certainty.
Okay, so that's quantity. What's next?
Second, quality. Our judgments are affirmative, the object is round; negative, the object is not square; or infinite, the object is non-square. These lead to the categories of reality, negation, and limitation. These are necessary conditions for determining what properties an object actually has, its reality, by setting its limits against what it negates.
Okay, and the third one, relation, you said, is the most crucial.
It is. We judge hypothetically if A, then B, categorically, Socrates is a man, or disjunctively, it is either A or B. These forms of judgment give rise to the categories of substance and accident, causality and dependence, and community, or reciprocity.
So causality, the concept Hume couldn't find in experience, is systematically derived from the logical form of hypothetical judgment. We must apply it to phenomena, otherwise we can't coherently think about the relationship between events and time.
Exactly. Causality is thus constitutive of experience, not derived from it. It's an unavoidable rule of our mental operating system. If something happens, our mind must search for a cause, otherwise that event remains incoherent. And then fourth, modality. This deals with the assertion of certainty. Problematic, A may be B, esoteric, A is B, or apodictic, A must be B. These forms yield the categories of possibility, impossibility, existence, non-existence, and necessity contingency. These allow us to make judgments about whether a phenomenon is possible or impossible, whether it currently exists, and whether it must exist.
So the categories are not just ideas. They are the 12 universal a priori rules that the human mind uses to transform the chaos of sensory intuition into the coherent, objective world of phenomena that science investigates. It is a stunningly rigorous system designed to save the certainty of science from human skepticism.
And that framework, the systematic setting of the limits of theoretical reason, is the necessary prerequisite for the second great project. If theoretical reason is limited to phenomena, what guarantees moral truth, especially if morality can't be found in sensory experience? The answer must lie in what we call practical reason.
Right. Having established the boundaries of what we can know, Kant dedicated his attention to the question of what we should do. He developed his ethics primarily in the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals and the critique of practical reason, and the foundation of this system is the good will.
This is a radical interior shift from morality. Kant argues that the source of the good lies only in the good will itself, not in external factors like consequences, natural inclination, or even happiness. The good will is the only thing good without qualification.
Why does the source matter so much? I mean, if I save a life, surely the outcome is what counts.
For Kant, the outcome is contingent on external factors, chance, luck, intervening physics. Moral worth has to be absolute and universal, and the only thing that is completely within the agent's control is the will, the intention behind the action. A good will is one that acts from duty in accordance with the universal moral law, regardless of whether the action actually succeeds in achieving its desired outcome. The motivation for acting on this law is simply its inherent rightness, what Kant termed worthiness to be happy.
Okay, so if a well-intentioned, dutiful action fails because of bad luck, it retains its moral worth. But a successful positive outcome that was driven by a selfish motive, like a shopkeeper giving correct change just to keep a good reputation, that lacks moral worth.
Precisely. The shopkeeper is acting in accordance with duty, but not from duty. His action is merely pragmatic. This immediately connects morality to practical reason and freedom. Kant defines practical as everything that is possible through freedom, and since moral actions require a free choice to act from duty, freedom is the highest postulate of his ethics.
If we are not free, morality doesn't exist. Correct. Pure practical laws are the moral laws given by reason a priori. They dictate what is to be done. And these are distinguished sharply from merely pragmatic or technical laws, which guide free action towards specific sensory-derived ends, like maximizing profit or building a bridge. Moral laws are absolute commands of reason.
This leads us to the distinction that grounds moral obligation, the difference between hypothetical and categorical imperatives.
A hypothetical imperative is conditional. It commands an action that must be obeyed if you wish to satisfy a specific contingent desire. If you want to be hired, you must prepare a strong resume.
Right.
You can opt out of the desire, decide you don't want the job, and the imperative just vanishes. It's always goal-oriented.
And the categorical imperative is unconditional. It binds all rational agents, full stop. We can't opt out of it because, in Kant's framework, we can't opt out of being rational agents capable of freedom.
Exactly. The moral law must therefore be entirely formal. It can't rely on content tied to a specific desire. It must be the form of lawfulness itself. Kant provided several formulations of this singular imperative, and the process of testing an action against the categorical imperative is known as the universalization test.
How does that test work?
You must take the maxim, the subjective principle of your intended action, and ask, could this maxim be universalized into a law of nature without contradiction?
Give us the classic example of the lying promise.
Okay? Suppose your maxim is, I will make a lying promise to secure money when I'm in dire need. If you try to universalize that maxim, make it a universal law that everyone should lie whenever it benefits them, you run into a contradiction. If everyone made lying promises, the entire institution of promising would collapse. No one would ever believe a promise again.
So if I universalize the maxim, I've destroyed the very condition that made the action possible in the first place. That's a contradiction in conception, and that action is deemed a perfect duty. It is strictly forbidden.
Exactly. That is the first or universal law formulation. But the second key formulation of the categorical imperative, the one that really defines human value, is the principle of treating humanity as an end.
This formulation has profound social and political implications, far beyond simple personal morality.
It does. It obliges us to treat humanity, which Kant understands as rational agency and autonomy in ourselves and in others, always simultaneously as an end in itself, and never merely as a means to achieve individual ends.
Let's clarify merely as a means. If I hire a contractor to fix my roof, I am clearly using them as a means to a house repairing end. Is that morally wrong?
Not at all, because you are respecting their rational agency. You enter a contract freely, recognizing they have their own goals, like earning money and their own autonomy. You are using them as a means, but simultaneously treating them as an end. You're respecting their personhood.
So where is the line crossed?
The line is crossed when you use someone merely as a means, violating their rational agency. This includes manipulation, deception, because it prevents them from consenting to your maxim, or, in the most extreme case, enslavement. These actions fail the categorical imperative because they treat a rational, autonomous being as if they were a non-rational, disposable tool.
So Kant's ethics establish that our moral value does not come from our social utility, our feelings, or our consequences, but purely from our status as rational, autonomous beings capable of giving ourselves universal moral law. That is the foundation of deontology.
It is the grounding of self-respect and the respect for others, and it's entirely derived from reason, bridging the gap left by the necessary limitations of theoretical knowledge established in the first critique.
Okay, so we've covered the mind's limits in Critique 1 and moral laws in Critique 2. Kant's final major work, The Critique of Judgment, which came out in 1790, is often seen as the capstone of his system. It integrates aesthetic theory and teleology. It asks, how can subjective feelings of beauty and purposiveness still lay claim to universal validity?
The third critique is where Kant tries to bridge the chasm between the determinism of the phenomenal world, so science, and the freedom of the moral world, ethics. He uses the term aesthetic in its modern sense, dealing with feeling, taste, and reflection.
Let's start with beauty, which he analyzes as a judgment of taste.
Kant argued that the judgment of beauty is unique because it's characterized by disinterested pleasure. It's not a property of the object itself, it's the conscious pleasure we feel when the representation of the object prompts a free play between the imagination and the understanding. We don't want to consume the object or own it or use it to satisfy a need. We just enjoy the harmonious operation of our faculties when we're perceiving it.
And crucially, even though it's a subjective pleasure, we feel it lays claim to universal validity.
Exactly. When you look at a perfectly formed painting, you feel compelled to say, "This is beautiful," and you expect others to agree, even though you can't prove it with a determinate concept or a scientific law. This universal expectation is derived from the notion of common sense, the idea that all humans share a fundamentally similar cognitive structure that allows for this harmonious free play.
The sublime, however, is a different experience entirely. It seems less about harmony and more about the failure of our faculties.
The sublime is a feeling that arises when we confront something so vast or so mighty that it overwhelms the imagination. It's a subjective aesthetic quality that refers to an indeterminate relationship between our imagination, our sensibility, and our reason. It engages reason in a way that feels similar to moral judgments, because it reminds us of the superiority of our rational self over our sensible self.
And he divided this into two types, starting with the mathematical sublime.
Right, the mathematical sublime occurs when the imagination fails to grasp something absolutely great or boundless in scale, like looking up at the stars on a clear night or attempting to visually measure a towering glacier. Our imagination strains to comprehend the size, and it just fails. The pleasure, surprisingly, is taken in the fact that our reason steps in and asserts the concept of infinity or absolute magnitude. The failure of our imagination proves the greatness and superiority of our rational mind.
Reason triumphs over our limited senses, and the dynamical sublime deals with terrifying power.
That's the sense of dread or potential annihilation we feel when the imagination attempts to comprehend overwhelming might, a volcanic eruption or a stormy ocean crashing against the cliffs. Our sensible, physical self feels tiny and powerless, but our reason resists this annihilation. The pleasure is derived from the recognition of our own inviolable moral vocation, proving our independence from nature's power. It's the feeling of confronting the terrifying forces of nature and realizing that while they can destroy our bodies, they cannot destroy our free moral will. It helps develop moral character.
It's truly amazing that this cohesive system, built in the 18th century, manages to connect the certainty of science, the necessity of morality, and the nature of aesthetic feeling into one grand structure. But we have to acknowledge that 2 centuries later, the certainty of his scientific foundation, particularly the necessary nature of causality, faced a massive challenge from 20th century physics.
Oh, absolutely. The emergence of quantum theory, particularly Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, seemed to deliver the death blow to Kant's epistemology. Kant had staked everything on the a priori status of the principle of causality and the possibility of completely determining objects in space and time.
But the uncertainty principle says you cannot simultaneously determine both a particle's position and its momentum with arbitrary precision. So if necessary causal determination is impossible for a fundamental particle, how is Kant's system not refuted?
Well, this forced philosophers and physicists to reevaluate what objective experience actually means. And interestingly, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, Niels Bohr, developed a view that was highly Kantian. Bohr argued that our necessary forms of knowledge position, momentum, spatiotemporal location are idealizations derived from the classical or phenomenal world. They apply simultaneously only within a limited classical domain of human experience.
But how does this save Kant's a priori concepts?
For a Kantian, to determine an object of possible experience, a phenomenal object, you must be able to determine it according to both spatiotemporal criteria, so position, and dynamical criteria, so causality and momentum. The uncertainty relations show that for quantum entities, this simultaneous complete determination is impossible in principle.
Wait, okay, I think I see the connection. If you cannot completely determine the entity in space and time according to the rules of causality, then it cannot fulfill the conditions of a phenomenal object that we are capable of knowing.
Exactly. The object we describe with quantum state parameters is therefore not an object of possible experience in the classical Kantian sense. It's an abstract object, or perhaps even a noumenon, something we can refer to mathematically, but cannot fully intuit. Since it's not a phenomenal object, it is not required to conform to the constitutive a priori laws, like strict causality, that govern the phenomenal world.
So the uncertainty of quantum mechanics doesn't invalidate Kant's categories. It actually proves the accuracy of his prediction that our cognitive conditions set necessary limits on what we can experience as nature.
It reinforces transcendental idealism. The categories remain constitutive for the macroscopic world of possible human experience, which relies on classical concepts. But they are only regulative for nature as a whole. We are required to investigate nature as if it were causal, because that's the only way our cognition functions. But we must acknowledge that the underlying reality of the noumena does not necessarily conform to those rules.
That is a brilliant pivot, using the limits of science to confirm the limits of reason. And this leads perfectly into the most contemporary application of Kantian philosophy, applying the principle of self-limitation and critique to artificial intelligence, specifically large language models and the pervasive problem of hallucination.
This is a truly cutting-edge area of research. Researchers are drawing explicit parallels between Kant's critique of pure reason and the constraints necessary for stable AI reasoning. They are conceptualizing AI hallucination not just as a factual error, but as epistemic instability.
That phrase, epistemic instability, sounds very Kantian. It implies a failure to apply the necessary constraints on reasoning.
That's precisely the concept. Hallucination is modeled as instability caused by a lack of internal critique or necessary bounds. Researchers have developed a measurable structural index called H-risk, hallucination risk, which links the internal instability of the model's representations to its confidence and calibration behavior. The goal is to enforce a Kantian self-limitation on synthetic reason.
The sources outline a fascinating practical application, introducing a Kantian-inspired policy where the model is structurally permitted to say, "I cannot judge," effectively forcing a moment of internal critique.
And the results were significant. By allowing the model the option to refuse to assert knowledge, to acknowledge its own boundary, it led to targeted, measurable reductions in errors in high-stakes, specialized domains, such as medical epidemiology. This shows that the act of critique of self-limitation is functionally stabilizing for an intelligent system.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting, though. The stable miscalibration paradox. The sources say that analysis showed that confident errors were often just as stable internally as confident correct answers.
This is the profound paradox revealed by deep structural analysis of LLMs. Contrary to the intuitive assumption that a wrong answer should be the result of a shaky, weakly supported internal representation, they found that confidently wrong AI answers are often instances of stable miscalibration.
Wait, so the model isn't just guessing. Its hallucination is a robust, internally consistent conclusion that is supported by a stable internal architecture. It's a functional yet profoundly incorrect attractor.
Yes, the hallucination behaves like a robust but misaligned attractor. For models operating at a low effective signal temperature, the representations can become frozen into these confidently wrong but locally stable states.
This has massive implications for how we fix AI. It means that simple output-only corrections, like resampling or turning down a creativity dial, won't work because the error is deep within the reasoning process. The intervention must target the reasoning process itself, perhaps by incorporating deep critique and revision loops, forcing the AI to question its own maxims, much like Kant forced human reason to question its own limits.
And finally, Kant's deep insight into the limits of language and definition provides a partial explanation for why AI remains fundamentally unexplainable. Kant noted that a definition is always incomplete. It expresses a concept only to the extent that it is distinguishable from others, but never its absolute entirety.
Because we simply don't have complete, fixed, and rigorous definitions for many of the most complex concepts we use daily, like consciousness or beauty, or even the concept of the self, I.
Exactly. Since we lack a complete definition for the human concept of I, we cannot fully assess the complete functional implementation of that word in an LLM.
Uh-huh.
The model acquires the linguistic ability to manipulate the concept of I fluently, allowing it to function and answer questions, but without necessarily implementing the deep, multifaceted cognitive function behind it. Kant understood this gap between functional fluency and genuine understanding, a necessary boundary set by the very nature of human language and reason.
This has been an incredibly rich deep dive into a thinker who provides perhaps the most comprehensive philosophical structure in history. We started with Kant's Enlightenment project, realizing his goal was to save reason and science from the paralyzing skepticism of Hume.
We established the rigorous structure of his transcendental idealism, defining knowledge as the necessary combination of sensible intuitions and intellectual concepts, structured by a priori categories like causality, leading to a world of knowable phenomena distinct from the unknowable noumenal world.
And we explored the absolute formal demands of the categorical imperative, which grounds all moral action in autonomy and duty, requiring us to treat all rational beings, including ourselves, as ends in themselves.
And we connected Kant's foundational demand for critique, for reason to recognize and respect its own necessary boundaries, directly to contemporary computer science, where these principles are now being actively applied to diagnose and constrain artificial intelligence models prone to deep structural errors like stable miscalibration.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner, integrating the principles of Kantian philosophy into your modern understanding of the world?
The deepest challenge Kant presents, whether we are analyzing human thought or synthetic reasoning, is this profound question. What happens when stability does not equal truth? We have seen that AI can achieve stable miscalibration, where its confidently wrong conclusions are internally robust and highly resistant to correction. Kant compels us to apply that same rigorous critique to ourselves. We must ask, are our own deeply held, confidently asserted, potentially flawed beliefs similarly robust, yet fundamentally misaligned with reality, protected by layers of internal stability? Kant demands perpetual intellectual vigilance, pushing us to constantly ask, what are the limits of our knowledge? And when we act, are we truly acting from duty or just from a sophisticated hypothetical desire dressed up in moral language? That relentless pursuit of self-critique is the essence of true enlightenment.